Okay, Dad, today is Monday, August 12th, and let's start off talking about Ukraine and Russia. So, what are the latest updates with the Kursk incursion?
Okay, well, the fighting remains intense. As I said last time, there are a number of, hundreds, maybe 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers that are dug in the settlements, very close on the Russian side of the border, but very close to the border. And they're putting up a stiff fight, and also they're being reinforced. There are reserves on the Ukrainian side that are being brought in and to again support the Ukrainian effort. But they don't seem to be going anywhere. I mean, sometimes you get these reports that they've driven deep into Russian territory, but I think it's more of the same. We're not talking about occupying forces, but rather small detachments that go in and sometimes spread chaos. You conduct reconnaissance, shoot at some civilians if they're still there. But these forces, these units aren't large enough to occupy and hold territory. So, they go in, they create some chaos. They're either killed or captured by the Russians. That's one possibility, or they make it back to the Ukrainian side of the line. Um, it sounds like more of the lines are starting to the line there is starting to stabilize, and then we're seeing something more like what we're seeing in other parts of the line. It was chaotic for a few days when they conducted the surprise attack, but it's no longer a surprise attack, and the line is firming up. And I think we'll just see the Russians systematically, incrementally, just drive them out back into Ukrainian territory, back into Sumy. And then quite possibly the Russians may just continue going because, again, there was talk that that's actually where the Russians were planning to conduct their offensive. And now they, have a perfect a justification for carrying it out. There's a need to establish a buffer zone, a cordon sanitaire there on the other side of the border, as they did in Kharkov. So I think maybe this episode will be followed quite possibly, by a Russian offensive into Sumy.
Have we heard any statements from Kiev or the West, NATO, Washington about what the objectives of this incursion were? What was the reasoning? Why did they do
Well,
this? It's
yeah, we hear actually, I think we listed um, three theories last time, and all of
mm,
those theories have been expressed, by one or another official in the Kiev regime. So one is a diversion. The other is to sow fear, right? Panic, which is really, again, terrorism, shooting at civilians and spreading false information. Um, and then a third is to seize territory and use it as a bargaining chip in negotiations. So
mm.
these are all of these have been expressed. One theory, or that the Kiev regime hasn't expressed directly, but a lot of people suspect may have been an objective of this offensive, was the seizure of the Kursk Nuclear Power Plant, which is several tens of kilometers on the other side of the border. They never got close to that. Um, and it looks like, that I don't think that was ever seriously possible, but it may have been something that they were after. We can't ever, well, I don't know that we can know for sure that that's something they were going for or not. Um,
What would be the reason to seize the power plant as a bargaining chip or
yeah, it's essentially, it would be, you know, that's something they could use, maybe to blackmail um, the Russian government with. They've shown the willingness to conduct they've attacked the Zaporozhye plant again and again over these last couple of years, ever since the start of the SMO. They've been attacking that plant and attempted to seize it, and very recently did serious damage to one of the cooling towers and caused a fire. So they haven't shown any kind of reluctance to damage, or potentially even cause a serious accident at a nuclear power plant. And they could seize it, or they could simply attack it, um, uh, cause some sort of serious nuclear accident and then blame it on the Russians. Now, it would be obvious that it wasn't the Russians that did it, but you have a very cooperative Western media, and they could support the story that the Kiev regime, puts forth, the explanation. That's happened again and again in Zaporozhye. I mean, it's been ridiculous. It's obvious that the Russians haven't been shelling a nuclear power plant that they own and operate, right? It doesn't make a bit of sense. But I remember reading stories from a couple of years ago that didn't quite go so far as to say that definitely the Kiev regime was talking, but they obfuscated the matter so much that, you read at the end of the article, your head was spinning and you thought the Russians were doing something bad. And so, who
Well,
knows?
just
Who
like
knows
the
exactly what they
Russians,
thought?
right? Just like how the Russians blew up their own pipeline, Nord Stream 2,
Right,
right?
right.
So is the intention of the Kiev regime when they're shelling the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, is it to cause some type of nuclear catastrophe, nuclear disaster? Is that their aim?
Well, it's hard to explain. It certainly seems to be a possibility. I mean, um, I think that is an aim. The other possibility is that they want to damage it to the point that it simply can't operate anymore. Um, but it's a very risky business. I mean, when you shell a nuclear power plant,
Yeah,
you
well, you
do,
can't. It's not precision. You're
yeah,
not fine
right.
tuning it.
Right. I mean, if the plant is running at that time and then like a cooling tower is damaged, you could do serious damage to that plant, and potentially there could be a radiation leak or even worse. I mean, that's a risk that you're running when you do something like that, right? And they know it. They know it. So I think it shows desperation. It shows that that they know that they're losing and they have to do something crazy and hope it works. They can create an incident that could be used as a justification for bringing in NATO, right? They hope that something like that could happen. They could claim, oh, this is a nuclear incident, and somehow the Russians are responsible for it. Now we can't sit. The NATO can't sit idly by. NATO has to come in. No, I
So,
don't know
well,
that
so,
NATO
well,
would fall for it, but who knows? There are forces within NATO that might want to seize on that.
well, NATO and the West, they know that it's Ukraine
They
shelling
have to.
Zaporozhye plant.
They have to.
Everybody knows. Like you said,
Right.
Russia controls the plant. They're
Right.
holding it. They're
Right.
operating it.
Yeah.
So they're not shelling themselves. It's very
Right. Right.
clear.
But again, I
I
just
don't
tell
even
it
know how
like
you
if
can
you're.
spin that.
Yeah. Well, but they do it. I mean, that's the crazy thing. I mean, I remember reading those articles from a couple of years ago, and it was just ridiculous. But it's through convoluted sentences and excessive use of the passive voice. You end at the end of the article, you're confused about who's doing what. You have to stop and think. Well, wait a second, who runs this? But it's such a just a lot of smoke is being blown in these articles, like squid ink. In the end, you're confused and you know what's up and what's down. And if you're not a very careful consumer of news, which is true of most people in the West, you're just left with the impression that the Russians are doing something bad, and it has to do with radiation, and that's very bad. Again, it doesn't make any sense. It's just sort of a word salad, an association of words, but there's no logic there. But that's so much of our news right now.
Right. So this Kursk incursion, essentially, Ukraine opened up a new front inside Russian territory. But this seems to be a very poor strategic move. If
Right,
Ukraine is short on manpower, you
right,
don't want to open up another front, right? So,
exactly. I mean, it actually played into the Russians' hands. It's right. As you pointed out last time, they have the reserves, so they don't have to. Russia does, so they don't have to pull units away from the front line anywhere else. They had reserves that they could bring in, and they have brought in, and they are now stabilizing the front. Just what do you call it? Was the northern forces. Um, I guess it's the North Group or of the Russian armed forces. They had just for that Kharkov offensive. They didn't commit all of them to that Kharkov offensive. They held, a couple tens of thousands in reserve, and then just that group had a number of reserves that they could commit to this fight. And then, of course, there are other reserves. Again, Russia has close to 1 million men under arms now in the area. 700,000, I think, is what within the SMO area, and less than half of them are actually there on the front line. So they have many men that they can commit to this. It's a certain, and then, but to do this, to pull off this stunt, the Ukrainians had to pull men from these areas where these really strategic points on the line, places like Chasiv Yar and Ocheretino and Toretsk, where the Ukrainians are being pounded, again, at very important strategic points. They had to pull men off of from these places and send them up north to Sumy to pull off the stunt, where there really is no military objective. There was just this kind of pie in the sky idea of, perhaps, we don't even know if that's what they're thinking, but perhaps of seizing the nuclear power plant. There are a lot of stories have come out. I mean, again, if you look at kind of the mainstream consumer-oriented media, you'll get the sense that the Ukrainians are doing something incredible up there in Sumy, and the Russians are being humiliated and whatever and so forth. But if you actually read analysts, pieces by serious military analysts, Western analysts, and supporters of Ukraine, it seems like many of them, if not the majority of them, are saying makes no strategic sense whatsoever. This was very foolish. And recently there was some information leaked to the Times of London that said that apparently, like, the Ukrainian military was fighting this idea. They themselves thought this was really stupid, but it was Zelensky. Zelensky had his heart set on it, for months. Again, he's just obsessed with. He wants to always go on offense, and he's very concerned about publicity. And the news has been nothing but bad for such a long time. He wanted to create some good news, right? And temporarily among the know-nothings, he has created some good news. You have the sense, wow, the Russians again have been humiliated or whatever. But people who are looking at the bottom line are looking at, actual, the physical reality, the personnel and equipment. They're saying that you had very precious resources and you're wasting it on this really non-military stunt. There's just no military objective here. It's doing nothing for you. And when it's all over, you're just going to be that much weaker than you were before. You've, again, accelerated the process of your defeat.
I was watching the news the other day, and they were saying that that this was a great surprise attack by Ukraine, and it's going to destabilize Russia, and that Russia is having to pull troops off of the line for this. Is there any truth to that at all?
No, I don't think there's a bit of truth to it. There's really none at all. And one thing is, you can see that, again, where the big battles are being fought, the Russians are moving forward even more rapidly than they were before. Again, in Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Ocheretino, and Kupiansk too. It's not that the Russian advance has slowed down or stopped; quite the reverse. The Ukrainians are retreating faster than they were before. And then, I know this maybe doesn't mean anything, but here I am in Moscow. You never even know that there's a war going on. Life is very normal. People forget one thing, is that Russia is a very big country. And what's happening on I'm sure if you're living in Kursk, you have reason to be nervous. And certainly if you're in those villages, you can even have reason to be terrified. But it's a very small sliver of a very, very large country. And yeah, I'm sure people who follow the war closely are concerned, but it's not affecting the lives of the average Russian and 99.5% of Russia.
Okay, well, it's clear that Ukraine is losing this war. I think even the people in the West, in London and DC, realize this as well. And maybe we can take a little step back and talk about what does this mean really for the West when Ukraine does lose this war? The longer it goes on, what does this mean for NATO? How do you think this plays out?
Yeah, well, it's first of all, it's going to be a huge blow to the prestige of NATO. Obviously, NATO had this aura of invincibility. It was the most powerful military alliance in the world. That's the way that most of the world looked at it. And if Ukraine is solidly defeated in this war, and it's clear that, again, that Ukraine really was a proxy for NATO. It's been trained by NATO. It's been equipped by NATO. It's received intelligence from NATO. A lot of these operations have been planned by NATO. It's been Ukraine has been, everything is NATO in everything but name, you could say. And if Ukraine is solidly defeated, you have to say that this is a real blow to the prestige of NATO. That's one thing. Um, what will the reaction be? Well, you could say it could lead to, it could be a wake-up call to NATO, and that the NATO could actually pull together and 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 beef up its military strength. It could reform itself. That's a possibility, right? I mean, you have to say that it could be, but it's just so far I haven't seen anything. You get all this talk about this very alarmist talk from the leaders of NATO member states. This, sometimes they'll or defense ministers of member states who will predict a war with Russia in a few years. You hear that from Britain or Germany. Macron has been talking about actually sending soldiers to the conflict area and so on and so forth, right? But then when you look at, that's all talk. But when it actually comes to changing things on the ground, like, you know, most importantly, increasing their defense budgets, you don't see it. It's just not happening. To give you one example, Germany very recently said, okay, we'll meet our 2% requirement, right? But then they actually fudged it. They're playing these accounting tricks. So, well, now we're going to include like things like road construction in our defense budget because roads are dual use. Tanks can go down them as well as civilian cars and trucks. And then we'll include military pensions, whatever. Again, they're playing these accounting tricks, so it's even less than 2%. Now, Britain, I think, increased their defense spending from it was like 2.3 to 2.5. But these are not the actions of people who seem to be really serious about it. I mean, it seems to be all talk. I don't, maybe there'll be a point where all of a sudden they say, "Oh my God, we're at war, we're lost, we've got to do something," and you could see a new NATO, a reinvigorated NATO. I just don't. Somehow I get a sense that this is not going to happen. I think we would see some signs of that happening already, and I don't see it. It just seems like these people they're not really serious about fighting. They love to have Ukraine fight for them, and then they can talk big and they can deplete their stockpiles, but that's you don't see really anything more than that.
Right. This conflict has made NATO weaker considerably, not
Right.
stronger, and we haven't seen really any ability to ramp up or scale. We are also seeing a bit of division within Europe, and that's something that I'd like to explore a little bit more. Do you think that there's going to be more and more European countries that are going to become disenchanted with NATO and specifically the United States? We already have Hungary, Turkey, Slovakia, and to some extent, countries like Italy, Maloney, that seems to realize like, hey, maybe we should have had closer ties with Russia and China. Russia provides energy, is a border, borders the EU. They should be a logical trading partner. China is the manufacturing belt of the world. They make everything for us. We've cozied up with the United States. What do they make? They make dollars and bring death and destruction and send around the world and cause refugees to flood into our countries. And it doesn't, if you just look at it rationally, the U.S. does not seem to be a very good partner for these countries. And I feel like more and more countries will slowly come to that realization. Some already have. What do you
Right.
think will happen within the EU? Will we see more fracturing?
There certainly is the potential for that. As you say, there are, two countries that clearly have broken away, from the anti-Russian, especially the anti-Russian consensus. That would be Hungary and Slovakia, right? Now, at the same time, those countries are being subjected to real pressures. Um, I think it was Ursula von der Leyen who said that we have a lot of tools. Again, like if you don't go along with us, there are things we can do to hurt you, right? To They can apply the screws, they can bend the arms, and a country like Hungary is really very small. It's a difficult fight. Slovakia, if anything, is even smaller. Um, so I think they need some allies, or they're going to have to actually make a break and really, rather than assuming, remaining within the EU and trying to plow a different course. That may not be a viable strategy. In the end, the EU just may consume it. It may be a choice. You have to say, well, we have to leave the EU and we have to leave NATO. And they're not talking about that now, but maybe there's some talk about that in Hungary. Um, um, but if they're going to remain within the EU, I would say that it's a difficult struggle for them unless they get some larger countries uh, um, to work as allies. A country like Italy, for example, if Italy could side with them, that could change things, and they could really sort of create a counterbalance to the current establishment, and then we could see some real fracturing within NATO, and or maybe NATO could eventually, not just NATO, but the EU could take a different course. But we're not there yet.
Yeah. No, I can see that happening. I mean, there's also, the Russia-Ukraine war is obviously causing some division within the EU, and as this war has to end eventually, and it's clear that Ukraine will lose this war. And the way that we're going by constantly supporting this, the loss, the defeat is going to become more and more humiliating the longer we wait, the longer that we refuse to go to the negotiating table and talk about actually settling something, because it's just going to result in more deaths of Ukrainian, soldiers, as well as more territory lost the longer we wait. So it's going to be very humiliating. I think it's going to be a very tough pill to swallow. And when that
Mhm.
happens, there's going to be a big blame game that might cause people to start to split. But not only do we have this issue that is rising and that is going to, I think, implode once the Kiev regime eventually falls. A lot of finger pointing will happen. But we also have what's happening in Gaza, in Israel right now, which is I think has to be causing a lot of tensions and upset people within the European elite as well. Countries like Spain are very against Israel's
Mhm.
actions. The European Union, who is it, Foreign Policy Chief Borrell, has
Mhm.
called for sanctioning Ben Gvir and Smotrich. Um, what is this also? All this for me is playing into a real sort of crisis within the European Union as these
Mhm.
conflicts explode, because we're trying to stick. They want to keep a consolidated, collected front, saying that we stand with Ukraine, we stand with Israel, but that's becoming increasingly more difficult as more and more people start to realize, hey, maybe we're on the wrong side of this, or at least maybe we should talk about ending these conflicts so not more people
Mhm.
die. And especially on the wake of what we're seeing in Gaza, Israel just bombed another school, killed
Yeah.
over 100 people. I mean, this
Mhm.
happens almost daily. It seems like,
Right.
and it's
Right.
just
Right.
how much longer it can go on before it's not sustainable, right? So, how do you think that factors into what's going to happen with the EU and the U.S. standing in the rest of the world, and just
Well,
our
yeah.
relationship?
Right. Um, well, yeah. There's that tension as well. the thing is that in general, not always, but in general, it's pulling in the opposite direction of the uh, of let's say the controversy over the support for the Ukraine war, because most of the political parties that are opposed to supporting Ukraine, for example, Viktor Orban's party in Hungary, or um, or the National Rally in France. They oppose the Ukraine war, but they tend to stand with Israel. Like, for example, Hungary was one of, I think, only two European countries that recently voted on the side of Israel in a recent UN vote. Now, that's not true of every party. There are some. They actually tend to be leftist parties that are both anti-Ukraine war and anti-Gaza war. For example, Mélenchon in France, who's a leftist. That's where he stands. And I believe the president of Slovakia does too. Or there's Sarah Wagenknecht, who leads a leftist party in Germany, and that's her stance too. But actually, like the most powerful anti-Ukraine war forces tend to be with Israel, so they're being pulled in different directions here. I don't know how it's going to play out, to be honest.
Well, we have seen these two conflicts seem to be completely unrelated and separated, but
Right.
thanks to Israel's actions in assassinating Ismail Haniyeh and striking the Iranian embassy in Damascus and everything that's going on, Russia has been very outspoken against what Israel is doing, condemning them very openly and providing military support to Iran, which by proxy means supporting Hezbollah and the Houthis. So we are seeing these two conflicts merge to some extent, and it's becoming the kind of Russia, Iran, Gaza conflict are becoming one solid block more so.
I wouldn't say it's one conflict, but they are linked at a certain level, right?
Right, they're becoming linked, and it seems like Russia is open to condemning Israel much more than than the West, right? Than it used to be, which is actually quite surprising because Russia-Israel relations, I don't know much about the history about it, but it was just at the beginning of this conflict in Ukraine, Russia, that it was actually the Israeli Prime Minister, what's his name? It's blanking. The former prime minister that was trying to negotiate a peace deal. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
between,
I know what you're talking about.
Who's that?
Right now his name. It's right at the tip of my tongue. I'll probably come, but I know he was actually involved in negotiating the Istanbul agreement. At the very beginning of the Yeah, he was the former prime minister of Israel. And
Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett.
There you go. You got it. There you go. Right.
I did it. All right. I'm proud of myself. Yeah. Right. So we had. So it's clear that I mean Russia was using the former Israeli prime minister to help negotiate a peace deal, Naftali Bennett, into the Istanbul Accords. Is it the Accords or the Istanbul Agreement? Right. And then you kind of look at the state of Russia-Israel relations right now. It's not good, right? Russia is openly condemning Israel, and it seems like Israel has to be nervous and afraid because they're watching what's happening in Ukraine and Russia to some extent, especially the IDF, and they're seeing the Russian capabilities, and now Russia is actively directly supporting Iran in this conflict. It is polling. Israel has to be very upset with this. So I just think it's an interesting development that we are building these two camps, and maybe we might begin to see a merge, because it is very true. When I post our content out there, we get a lot of people that really support our topics on the Palestinian cause when we discuss the atrocities that Israel's committing. But then there's always usually a backlash when we talk about the Russian point of view and the Russian-Ukraine conflict. It's very clear that these are two separate groups, that often the people that support Russia, these guys are very pro-Israel. And then, the people that are pro-Palestine are often very pro-Ukraine and
Right.
anti-Russia, which is just there's not a lot of continuity. But I hope we can bridge that gap and realize that the real
Yeah.
answer is to end these conflicts, to support peace and not be okay with targeting civilians, which Israel is clearly doing, and that we are seeing the Kiev regime.
Yeah, they're
That we
clearly doing it too.
try
Not
not
on the
to
same
play this political.
scale, but they're doing that.
Right, right. It's
Yeah,
just
no,
a
no.
problem with partisanship. People are
Right,
very right.
right. Yeah, well, I think that is because of just the political dynamics in the West, in particular in the U.S. and Western Europe, and for various historical reasons, there are these sympathies and alliances have developed, on one side of the aisle versus the other side of the aisle. There's really no logical reason why you should, take, for example, be concerned about Gaza and sympathize with the Palestinians, but then at the same time, supporting, the neo Nazis in Ukraine. I think it's logically inconsistent. But again, for partisan political reasons, because of the particular kind of configuration of politics in the West, that's what happens. I think when you get outside of the West, you just don't find that. But yeah, that's something that we deal with. Fortunately, there is some overlap. We're not the only ones that are, anti-Ukraine war or, and anti-Gaza, but hopefully over time that overlap will grow and that.
Right. Yeah, I feel like prior to 2016, 2015, when Trump came on the stage, there wasn't really much anti-Putin, anti-Russia sentiment in the West. It really seemed to become manufactured during the whole Russia Gate, collusion and the
Yeah.
just this demonization of Russia meddling in our of demonization of Putin, and this idea that Russia's been interfering in our elections, which is absurd. But
Yeah.
that's where I think it really originated. So I think a lot of people that are on the left that are very against Trump just sort of they just have one department in the brain, just Trump, Russia, and they keep that together. So it's very hard, I think, for the left to kind of look at it in just with a clear lens, look at it in an unbiased point of view, and not just look at what's happening and what this conflict is about, because they somehow think that Russia. They think that Russia is the reason why Trump is around, and it's a very crazy association that they've made, but it's because of our media that they pumped that for years.
I think if you probably press most of those individual, the more rational ones will say, okay, well, that's maybe not true, but there's just this association has been created. So it's just like there are a lot of negative feelings that now there's just sort of a negative aura around Russia and Putin that, again, that was largely manufactured during those Trump years. Now, the anti-Russia, anti-Putin thing does precede it. It does go back farther. I mean, Jeffrey Sachs said, like, even in the 1990s, he noticed that there was, a faction within the U.S. government that was already very anti-Russia. And and for that reason, he found that he couldn't get cooperation from the U.S. government in implementing economic and fiscal policies in Russia that he could get in other Eastern European countries. It's just there were people there already who just saw a chance to kick Russia while it was down. Now, I think they were a very small group, but they were very powerful. And just over time, though, that they've, that anti-Russia faction has grown stronger and has influenced U.S. policy. It certainly has. It certainly does precede 2016. But that's where it really took off and then became part of became a mass psychosis, you could say, and has really affected the public perceptions of Russia.
Right. It wasn't really center stage for most people. Most people didn't really have much of an opinion on Russia or Putin, I feel, before 2015, 2016. The average person did. Okay, well, maybe, is there any other updates you want to give on the Ukraine-Russia front, or should we move a little bit over to what's happening in the Middle East now?
No, I think we could could move on. Maybe I'll just comment very
Okay.
briefly on what you said earlier, just about the shift in opinion or the in relations between Russia and Israel, because I think that's really quite remarkable. At the start, when the conflict broke out, right after October 7th, or you could say on October 7th, Russia actually stayed very neutral. They were very, very careful, and all their news stories, even through the first couple months of the war, when it became clear that this was a war direct against the civilian population of Gaza, they did have a lot of stories on October 7th, but that's just shifted over time, and I think it's a couple of things. One, it is the open support for Ukraine by the Israeli government, but I think it's much more than that. It's just that the genocidal nature of this war became apparent, and it's poisoned relations with Russia, just as it's poisoned relations with much of the world. With the governments um, of most countries in the world. So now in Russia, you find that by a large majority, most of the population is sympathetic with Palestine rather than with Israel. Again, that's a real change and a contrast with the West, and especially with the U.S.